City of Somerville to introduce the overall project and the city side of things.
Thanks, Jason. Thank you everyone for joining today. I'm a transportation planner in the planning department in the mobility division. I'm really excited to launch this process and share with all of you some of the work that's been going on over the past few months and hear what you think about how we can improve the parking system in Somerville. And this study is about better managing our parking as well as prioritizing all of the other uses we might have for curb space in Somerville. I am joined by Suzanne Rinfrit, the Director of Parking, Jackie Stagnari, a Project Analyst in the Parking Department, and Kate White, an Outreach Coordinator here in the Mobility Division. You can see on the screen sort of the staff on the left that's helping manage this project. And we're also working with the Parking City Task Force, a group of folks, city staff, community representatives, representing sort of a broad range of stakeholders for this project. And they're going to serve as sort of our testing pool for ideas and things that might come out of this study. And with that, I will turn it back over to Jason.
All right, thanks so much, Justin. It's been an absolute great team at the city to work with, and I'll just move on here and introduce who we are on the consultant side of things. So let me just talk a little bit about Nelson Nygard first. So Nelson Nygard is a transportation planning firm. We work across a variety of transportation planning disciplines, everything from transit service planning to active transportation and safety, parking and demand management, of course, as well. And across all those disciplines, we really emphasize putting people first, right? And that's exactly the mindset that we're going to bring to this study as well. Nelson Nygard was brought on board by the city of Somerville to lead this parking and curb study. And I'll go ahead and introduce the core members of the team here. So my name is Jason Novsam. I am the project manager for the study. I'm a senior associate here in Nelson Nygard's Boston office, and I am also a Somerville resident. I am joined by the other members of the project management team, including Bryn Leopold, our deputy project manager, and Tom Brown, who is our principal in charge and one of our firm leaders in parking and curbside management. We also have a few strategic advisors on the team as well, including Allison Fletcher and Naomi Dorner from Nelson Nygard, as well as Ben Sands and our other friends from WGI who are joining us to provide insights on really the parking operations side of things. And then we're also joined by our planning staff, associates Laura Lopez and Colleen Chan, who are here on the call today as well. So the way that this meeting will work today is we will start by doing an overview of the project process, talk a little bit about some parking and curb concepts, just to sort of make sure we're all on the same page in terms of how we're thinking about parking and the curbside in Somerville. Then we'll go through some of the key findings that we have discovered to date as we've undertaken this work. We'll pause there for a minute and do a little bit of live polling with the full group to get some input on goals for the study and a few other items as well. And then we'll move into a group discussion. We have a few exercises planned. And I'll just say for everyone who's on the meeting right now, please submit your questions at any time via the chat. And we'll be reviewing and responding to those as we go along, as well as doing some moderated answers to those at key points in the presentation as well. And just a tip on that, as you go through the chat, just double check that your chat is set to transmit to everyone. That way, everyone in the meeting can see what you're typing and kind of engage in that conversation. And please just type in the chat if you have any issues related to that, and someone will go ahead and help you out. So with that, I will dive into an explanation of the project process. So you can see our study schedule here. So we really kicked off this phase of our work in August of 2021. Here we are in November at our first community meeting. This is not your only chance to engage with the study. So another big part of our engagement plan is our online survey. You can expect that to come online sometime next week. And if you registered for this meeting, you'll receive information on how to respond to that as well. And please feel free to share that with your friends and family and neighbors. We want to get as many people involved as we possibly can. So that's going to be extremely helpful for us as well. And then there's going to be 2 future public meetings as well, likely one in April to discuss draft recommendations from the plan, and then another in July where we'll really present final recommendations from the study. So just to zoom out a little bit, let's talk just briefly about what exactly it is that we want to learn by conducting this study. And the first question we really want to answer is, how can we prepare for the future of mobility in Somerville? So as we all know, over the last couple of years, the way that people travel and the way that people work and the way that they commute has changed very rapidly. We want to make sure that Somerville's parking and curb system is flexible and can respond to that. And we also want to make sure that our parking and curb management policies really reflect our community values. And that's a big part of why we're here today, is to understand exactly what those values are. So again, really looking forward to your input today. And I'll just pause here for a second and introduce some of the draft project goals that we've created. Again, this is something you'll have a chance to comment directly on a little bit later in this presentation, but I'll just review them briefly now. So the first draft goal that we've identified is a desire to maximize curb effectiveness. So what that means is really making the highest and best use of the limited curb resources that we have. We also believe that we want to improve pickup drop-off safety and efficiency. As you all know, the amount of vehicles doing both commercial and passenger pickup drop-off throughout the city continues to grow, and that can raise some safety concerns. So we want to address those. We know we want to improve commercial loading availability. We also want to decrease our drive alone mode share for residents and workers coming into the city. And that's really a big part of furthering our decarbonization goals for the overall transportation network. We know that we want to expand the bike network and improve access and safety for cyclists, improve transit performance and passenger access, advance our equity goals, and ultimately give people more space. And what that means is whatever neighborhood you live in Somerville, we want your streets to be welcoming. We want you to have space on the street to really live and work and play and enjoy, because the street is the single biggest part of the public realm in the city, right? So we really want to make sure that that resource is available for people. Another part of our process has been reviewing previous plans. So we've looked at a variety of neighborhood-specific plans, as well as, of course, the Somerville zoning ordinance, the Climate Forward Action Plan, and Summer Vision 2040, which is the city's overall master plan document, as well as some more recent plans, including public electric vehicle charging in Somerville. Another thing that we wanted to draw attention to at the beginning of this presentation is the fact that we have divided the city of Somerville into a variety of specific subareas for our analysis. So this is going to help us really understand if some neighborhoods in the city are traveling or parking or using the curb differently from others, and we'll call out some of those differences along the way through this presentation. But you can see how those subareas break down here and on this map on the right-hand side. Another thing we wanted to draw attention to is the fact that specifically Assembly Square, Innerbelt, and Brick Bottom, these are all somewhat transitional neighborhoods that are going to be changing quite a bit over the next few years. So for that reason, those areas, analysis of those areas really focuses more so on future trends rather than what is going on today. But we did want to make that distinction. And another big part of our study has been all of the data that we have collected over the last few months. So part of this project has been going out on the street and actually collecting an inventory of all of the assets and all of the regulations at the curb throughout the entire city. So yes, that means every single street in the city. You can see the different features that we collected here. And really what that allows us to do is understand exactly how every single block is regulated in terms of parking or loading regulations, really at any time of day or any day of the year, because of course, as we know, regulations vary at different times of day. We're also going to be collecting parking utilization information. So that means we go out to certain areas of the city and actually count how many cars are present on the street to understand how full those streets are. That's ongoing right now, and we're hoping to wrap that up later in November, but we'll share some early findings from that work as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and start talking about some parking and curb concepts, just to get us all sort of comfortable with some of the language and ideas that we're presenting today.
Hey, Jason.
Yes.
Sorry, we're getting a lot of questions posted to the comments. Do we want to pause at this section and take a look at those?
Yes, I think that's a great idea. And let me take a look here. Bryn, do you mind going ahead and reading those questions out to the panel?
Sure. I will try to pick a somewhat logical order, given that we haven't yet talked about a lot of the key findings. But there's a question about looking at the Complete Streets Ordinance, as well as the neighborhood plans for Ball Square and Magoon Square that were conducted in 2017. And I know that we are looking at a number of other studies that weren't listed in that timeline slide. So rest assured that we are looking at a lot of the insight and recommendations put in all the neighborhoods of Somerville. There's also talk about the ADA transition plan, which I don't know that we've gotten to yet, but we will definitely get to when we work towards our next steps and looking at potential trends and the scenario planning and recommendations. There's also a question about defining the advanced equity goals. So Jason, do you want to take that one? Or Justin?
Yeah, I think we need your input on what specifically that means for parking. But I think generally we want to make sure that the recommendations that come out of this study take equity into account. And a consistent theme that we've heard is that the current parking system, which is more of a first come, first serve system, is not necessarily equitable. And how do we prioritize curb space for those that are in the greatest need of it? And also, I think it's looking at how our curb space is distributed now between different types of regulations or different uses, and asking ourselves, is that an equitable distribution of space, given all of the transportation goals we're trying to achieve in Somerville? So, I think we need input about how exactly that would apply in a parking context.
Great, and we'll have some materials later in this workshop to kind of help address that question as well.
We also have a question about measuring success around the project goals, and we can get into that a little bit more later. We did have a question in our discussion section of the agenda to talk about those goals. So Daniel, I think we'll get to that later on in the agenda. And I think for now, a lot of the rest of the questions are likely to come up later as we dive into more of the key findings. So we'll have another time later on during the workshop to begin to address those and hopefully get to them during our presentation.
In the meantime, a lot of documents are being suggested. We've definitely reviewed most or all of those, but we'll be taking note of those in case we missed anything. Thanks for the suggestions.
And there is one comment that I'm just noticing here from Mark Niedergang, who says you'd suggest separating East Somerville from Assembly, Brick Bottom, and Innerbelt because it's completely different from those transitional areas. We completely agree, and that's actually exactly what we've done. So I think as we start getting further into the presentation, you'll sort of see how we've done that. But you're completely right. We don't view those areas as being the same, and we'll certainly separate them in our analysis. And for all the members of the project team, feel free to respond in the chat directly to questions, and then we'll periodically pause as well to continue the conversation. So let's move on here. So again, talking about some parking and curbside concepts. Of course, when we think about parking, we're typically thinking about, okay, that's where I store my vehicle. And that's certainly true. Parking is where we store our vehicles. But parking is also tied to a wide variety of other aspects of our community that are important to consider, right? So if we manage parking effectively, that can promote local business health. It can promote transit reliability. It can improve bicycle accommodations. It can improve the pedestrian environment and more as you see here. So again, that's really the goal of this study, right? It's, yes, we're addressing parking, but we want to address parking in a way that's mindful of all of these other things that we can accomplish. And another thing we want to keep in mind is really this reciprocal relationship between strategic parking management and broader mobility improvements. So for example, if we do a really great job managing parking, if we right-size the parking supply, if we do a great job with demand management, that can potentially free up space on the street to make more mobility improvements, to do things like expand our bike network or our transit network. And then that in turn further reduces pressure on the parking supply because people now have, better choices in terms of how they want to travel if they don't want to drive a car, thereby freeing up even more parking space. And then the cycle sort of just continues from there. So I think this study is a great opportunity to sort of kickstart this relationship and really set Somerville up for a very bright transportation future. Another thing to keep in mind, and I'm sure we all already know this, but people get around in very, very different ways. Somerville is an incredibly diverse place. And I think even if we're talking about one person's modes of travel, many of us use a variety of modes, right? Depending on what we're doing in a day, depending on where we're going, we travel or move in a different way. And increasingly, we also have things come to us, right? So whether that's package delivery, meal delivery, ride hailing, and on, the curb actually really needs to facilitate that type of activity as well in terms of things coming to us as well as where we're going ourselves. So let's talk a little bit about how the curb space is allocated today and how that relates to our transportation mode shares throughout the city. So in terms of how Somerville residents are moving today, right now, 37% of Somerville residents are driving alone to work, 34% are taking public transportation, and a total of about 58% are using non-driving modes. So if we look at how the curb is allocated now, and we'll talk about this more in a little bit, the vast majority of our curb is actually allocated to parking or some other type of vehicular use. So we can immediately see that the way that people are moving, the way that people are getting to work doesn't necessarily line up with the way that we've allocated the curb. And then if we look at our goals for the future, that is even more of a drastic observation, right? Because in the future, looking at our summer vision plan, we're aiming for 75% of residents traveling via non-driving modes, right? So if we're going to accomplish that, we really need to be mindful of how we allocate the curb and ensure that there's space allocated for all of those non-driving modes in order to ensure that we're able to make it to that target. And it's also an equity question as well. And I know that there were some comments about equity goals. Good curb management really means that we acknowledge the fact that we don't all have the same transportation needs. And if we look at this 75% number and we look at the trends of how people are already traveling, again, we need to make potentially some changes to ensure that the curb is managed in an equitable and inclusive way. And then finally, just as we sort of come to the end of this section here, another concept we wanted to introduce is this idea of flexible curbs, right? So I think all of us sort of understand how curbs can be used for parking, but there are quite a few other curb uses that can even make perhaps an even more efficient use and serve perhaps even more people in that same amount of space that a parking space would take, right? So a typical 20-foot curb space, that's about the size of a typical striped parking space. That can serve about one person per hour if we use that space for parking. If we use that space for bike or scooter storage, all of a sudden now we can serve 5 or 6 or 8 people in that same space. And then if we start thinking about using that space as a parklet or as a dining area, or maybe even a retail area, now we're talking about 10 or 15 or even 20 people who can actually benefit from that same space. So that doesn't mean that every parking space in Somerville needs to become a parklet, but it certainly means that we need to consider very carefully how we're using this really critical resource throughout the city. So I guess I'll just pause there again. It looks like we have quite a few more questions that have come in. And Bryn, did you want to read out any more of those?
Yes, sorry, they're coming in a few locations. Stephanie has asked how Somerville accounting for the fact that vehicles are getting larger. This applies both to commercial distribution and personal vehicles, including SUVs and pickups. And Jason, I think we can talk about the size of parking spaces and how that's collected in the inventory platform.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to respond to that, right now we've made an assumption that the average parking space length in Somerville is 18 feet. So that's a number that we've calibrated throughout the process of our field work. And just for your reference, the average physical length of a car is somewhere between 15 and 16 feet. And then of course, people typically use, leave some sort of gap between the next car. So that's the number that we're going with right now. That's a little bit more of that, a fairly conservative number. I think we all know how close people tend to park together on many streets in Somerville, but that is something that we're continuing to calibrate as we move forward.
And I was just going to highlight a couple of chats, a pair in which a business owner mentions that 10 out of their 13 employees live pretty far away from Somerville and need parking where they expected to park. And then another mentions clients who drive from far away. And I think this is exactly the tension point that's at the curb, which is a fixed capacity. It's a fixed piece of infrastructure versus off-street parking, which is a bit more fluid. So looking at how the two can work together to accommodate both needs is definitely a focus of this study.
There's also a question about access for service vehicles, including garbage collection and other similar type of larger trucks. And we will get into that a little bit later when we talk about curb functions and the regulations across the city. But Jason, is there anything else you wanted to add about service vehicles and parking?
I will just say that I completely agree. That's something that's really important to consider. And I think perhaps that's even worth elevating as we start talking about our goals, and we'll have another chance to do that as well. But certainly that's something we need to account for moving forward.
Right. And then I think a lot of chat posts are about, are we going to cover this or are we going to mention this? And I think hopefully those questions will be answered in the presentation. If they're not, please circle back to those questions and we'll address them later on.
Great. Okay. So I think I will go ahead and move on and cover some of the key findings so far. And again, we'll take more pauses and have some extended periods to answer chat questions. So feel free to continue to drop your questions in the chat. So I'll just move forward here. So the first area that we wanted to cover was a discussion of what the existing transportation network looks like today, not just in terms of parking, but in terms of how people are actually physically moving around the city, through a variety of different modes. So the first mode that we wanted to discuss was transit and our transit network. And you can see here today, about 25% of all households in Somerville are within a half-mile walk of a rapid transit station. When the Green Line extension comes online, that number is going to expand to 67%. So at that point, the majority of households in the city will have, a relatively convenient walk to rapid transit. Another thing worth pointing out is that 100% of households are actually within a half-mile of some form of transit stop, typically a bus stop. So there is at least some degree of transit access almost everywhere in the city, but of course that's variable. And we want to be mindful of some of the challenges that persist related to transit access. And this is important because residents of new buildings that fall within a half-mile of a transit stop are actually not eligible to get a residential parking permit per the latest designations in the Somerville zoning code. So we need to be really mindful again of how we're dealing with both parking, but also other forms of mobility in these areas to make sure people can actually move around the way that they need to. And another thing we wanted to highlight is that you can see today, 25% of households are within that transit area, and 26% of the residential parking permits that are active are also within that area, right? So those numbers, line up pretty well. When we look at the future transit areas, including Green Line extension, 74% of residential parking permits fall within that area versus 67% of households. So essentially what we're seeing here is there are more permits, permit density is essentially greater in those future transit areas versus the existing ones today. And what we would expect is the ratio of permits in the Green Line areas to fall over time once that service comes online. But again, that's something that we need to track over time. And then in terms of our bike infrastructure, we know that bike infrastructure interacts with parking quite a bit as well. We know that protected bikeway designs sometimes require curb space that was previously used for parking. And those protected bikeways are going to be a big part of the city's upcoming bike network plan. So we need to be careful about how we think about that as well. We also know that unprotected bike infrastructure needs to be managed carefully to make sure that we're avoiding conflicts and safety issues between bikes and adjacent parking and loading areas, right? So right now, 32% of the city's bike facilities are actually adjacent to parking or loading areas and don't have any protective barriers. And over time, I think it's a reasonable goal to want to see that number decrease and improve safety, for cyclists throughout the city. And then moving on, let's talk about some of the demographic and travel characteristics for people moving within and to and from the city. So this map here is showing us the driving mode share for residents in the city. Right now, as we kind of already previously mentioned, 37% of residents are driving alone to work. And I think this goes back to one of the comments that came up, but 57% of workers coming into Somerville are driving alone. So, as was stated previously, we do need to be really mindful of all of the workers coming into Somerville who are actually more reliant on driving and do create a daytime parking need. So part of this plan will certainly be finding ways to accommodate that parking demand for workers, not just the residents who are already living here. And just in terms of geography, I think it's worth pointing out a couple key areas when we look at this map. So the darker areas are areas where more people are driving to work. So we see that in East Somerville, a higher proportion of people are actually driving to work. Similarly in Winter Hill and Magoon Square, and then parts of West Somerville as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about maybe why some of that is in a little bit. So the next thing we wanted to talk about was how car ownership functions in Somerville. Again, we have mapped the number of zero vehicle households throughout the city. So the darker areas on the map are showing us where there are more zero vehicle households. So you can see what's interesting is the areas really adjacent to our rapid transit tend to have more zero vehicle households. I don't think that's a surprise. If we look at Davis Square and the part of East Somerville that is really closest to Sullivan Square, that makes a lot of sense. But what's interesting is for example, if we look at East Somerville, we already know that a large percentage of people are actually driving to work in East Somerville. So despite the fact that they have perhaps more zero vehicle households, the people that do own vehicles may be driving to work more often. So I think that's worth noting. And then another thing worth noting is if we look at Magoon Square and Winter Hill and 10 Hills, these areas have the highest level of average cars per household. So again, we might think that parking demand would be the greatest in those areas, but as we'll see in a little bit, that's not necessarily the case. So it's important to note that just because people own more cars, that's not the only thing that plays into the on-street parking demand. And we'll talk about that more. And then finally, we looked at concentrations of low-income households throughout the city. And I think coming into this study, the expectation may have been that lower income households typically own fewer vehicles per person, so they probably don't drive as much and maybe they don't need as much parking. But I think what we found is that's really not the case, right? So again, looking at East Somerville, it has a fairly high percentage of low-income households, but as we've already seen, quite a few of the workers who live in East Somerville are actually driving to work. So we would say there's really not a strong relationship between income and this need to drive, right? So I think it's going to be really important to make sure that we do in fact provide parking for low-income households, because they certainly may require access to vehicles. And part of that is due to the nature of their employment, right? So low-income households, they may not be traveling to downtown Boston. They may be working early in the morning or late at night when transit is less convenient. And part of that could be leading to why they actually need access to a car more than some of the higher income residents in the city. So I'm going to pause there again before we actually talk about how the curbside right-of-way is allocated, just because I know more and more questions are coming in.
Yes, there are more and more questions, and many refer to potential policy solutions or recommendations, as well as comments on existing conditions and some of the questions that we'll get to during the discussion period. For example, Ben writes that I think also landlords often disallow their tenants from using driveways because they believe street parking is ample. In parallel with an increase in a permit price, we could require landlords allow parking on off-street parking by their tenants, or charge them additional fees if they don't allow that, but have off-street parking available. So a lot of these questions and comments are something that we will look into as part of our analysis into different scenarios of how policy changes might impact the parking supply and parking demand in different areas of the town. But I think Jason will get into some of the findings about what the inventory looks like today.
And I would just add, please keep the policy suggestions coming, but we're sort of studying the parking system right now, so we don't necessarily have answers for all of the policies we might recommend for parking in Somerville. So definitely, please suggest things, but we may not know right now whether that makes the most sense for Somerville. But we'll definitely look into all those suggestions and get back to you all.
Thanks, Justin.
Great. Okay.
A big part of what we're trying to do today is take in information from you all. So we will be capturing everything from the chat. And if we don't address it on the call, that means we're looking into it.
Great. And I think as we continue the presentation here, there will be some additional information on, how well utilized the streets are, how busy they are at certain times of day. And that's going to be something we explore throughout the process as well. So definitely looking to dive into those questions. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how the existing curbside right-of-way is allocated. So there are about 200 miles of curb throughout the city of Somerville. About 100 miles of that is what we would call vehicle accessible curb. So that means a vehicle could actually pull up there and park or stop or load or something of that nature. So that's about 52% of all of the curb in the city that we would call vehicle accessible. And if we look at this table here, we can see how that breaks down even further. So about 50% of all of Somerville's curb is actually used for parking. About 38% of the curb has specifically a dedicated travel lane at the curb. So in that case, there wouldn't really be any parking or stopping allowed in that travel lane. About 19% of the curb is actually used for curb cuts for driveways, right? So that's almost a fifth of all of the curb is actually taken up by driveway access, which is sort of interesting and something to keep in mind. And then we have our other uses as well. So about 11% of the curb features dedicated bike infrastructure, 2% has some bus stops or other type of loading space, and then 1% featuring dedicated transit infrastructure like a bus lane. So again, thinking about our goals, thinking about how people are moving through Somerville, we can see that the way that curb is allocated today doesn't necessarily line up with how we expect people to move in the future, right? So that's something we need to think about as we move forward. So then let's dive even further into specifically that 52% of the curb that actually is vehicle accessible. So within that curb, we have almost 24,000 on-street parking spaces throughout the city, right? So that comes out to about 0.3 spaces per capita for residents of Somerville. And if we look at that by sub-area, you can see our various, sub-areas here. And the percent of curb dedicated to parking in each of those areas is a little bit variable. So for example, sub-area 2, which includes Davis Square and Powder House Square and Ball Square, about 71% of the curb is used for parking. And then we can contrast that with, say, Assembly Square, where only 26% of the curb is actually used for parking, and much more of it is used for travel lanes or other types of infrastructure. But for the most part, most areas of the city are hovering somewhere between 50 and 70% of the curb being used for parking. So how is all of that parking space regulated? Well, there's quite a few different regulations for parking across the city, but of course the main one, and the one that we're all probably most familiar with, is the permit parking space. And we'll be diving into parking permits in a little bit as well. Of course, we have areas that feature metered parking. We have time-limited parking. If you think about a street like Highland Avenue or Medford Street, most of those time-limited areas allow permit parking as well. And then we actually do have some unrestricted parking in Somerville. I know it's hard to believe, but there are actually a few hundred parking spaces in the city that are not actually restricted at all. And then, of course, we have various no parking designations, areas that are used for bus stops, and then a variety of different loading areas for commercial and passenger loading as well. And then, of course, we have accessible parking spaces as well, and that's something we want to talk a little bit more about as well. So when we break that down and we think about, okay, we have these 24,000 parking spaces, 17,000 parking spaces are used just for the permit parking, right? So the vast majority of parking is used for our permits, and then about 3,000 spaces fall under that time-limited designation as well, and those can typically be used by permit holders as well. We only have about 800 metered parking spaces, just over 600 unrestricted spaces, and then a few hundred spaces each of some of these other designations. And we did want to point out there's about 200 accessible parking spaces throughout the city, but those aren't necessarily well distributed. And we definitely want to dive into that and think about, are we doing a good enough job accommodating accessible parking throughout the city as well? So that's something to follow as we move forward. And in terms of how we're dealing with commercial and passenger loading, some of you may have seen this type of signage around the city. Right now, 4% of the curb is dedicated to some type of loading zone. And typically that is a combined commercial and passenger loading zone, like you see here, where there are some variable time limits depending on the type of activity taking place. And typically the way that those are cited is by really through request, right? So if a business owner or a resident or someone else makes a request for a loading zone, that's usually how that comes to the attention of the city. So now let's talk a little bit about the parking permit program. So I think this is going to be a big part of our study, understanding exactly how this works, how people are using it, and thinking about the potential for any policy changes moving forward. So right now, there are 27 different types of parking permits in the city. A lot of those are annual permits for residents of various types, but then we also have a variety of business permits for people who are business owners or potentially other types of workers. And then a variety of specialty use permits as well, visitor permits. So quite a few different permit types. I think one thing that's really interesting when we dive into this is just the volume of active annual permits. So we can see right now there are about 53,000 active annual permits in the city versus only about 20,000 permit parking spaces. So there's a couple of things that may be contributing to that. So part of that is the fact that people are transient and they move. And when they do move, if they move away from Somerville, they may not let the parking department know that they'll no longer be parking in the city. So they're sort of still in that 53,000 number, even though they're no longer using the parking system. So that's part of it. But the other big part of it is that we know that many people may have off-street parking, but they still buy the on-street parking permit because it's convenient and it allows them to park in other areas of the city. If they want to drive across town, they know that they can park using that permit. But in terms of parking at their home, they may not actually be using it. But that is something we want to continue to explore, and something we'd love to get feedback on today is what all of you think about permits being used in that way, not maybe just parking at home, but people are using them to park around town. Is that a type of activity that we support, or do we think that maybe that we want to change how that's managed? So another thing that's important that we've observed through our analysis is that the density of residential permits throughout the city is variable, right? So there are specific areas of the city that have more permits than others. Again, East Somerville shows up as an area with a very high resident permit parking demand. You can see that in the darker blue color here. Duck Village is another area that shows up with a lot of demand, and then some parts of West Somerville as well, and also Ball Square. So those are just some of the areas where we really just see a high concentration of permits. And then moving on, another thing that we've done here is looked at the ratio within each of these neighborhoods between the total number of parking permits and the available, or I should say the total number of on-street permit spaces. And that number actually varies quite a bit. So again, if we look at, say, East Somerville or Union Square, we have about 3.2 permits that are active for every one on-street space, right? Whereas if we look at, say, Magoon Square and Winter Hill, we have about 2.4 active parking permits per space. So in theory, that means it's potentially easier to park in an area like Winter Hill than, say, an area of East Somerville. So that's something we really want to pay attention to and understand. Is it much more difficult to park in certain areas of the city than others? And are there policies that we can put in place to help alleviate some of that challenge? So when we put all of this together, there's a couple key observations that we've made about how parking demand and permit demand works in Somerville. The first being that we see that areas that have more residential driveways, that tends to reduce the demand for on-street parking, which makes sense because people have more off-street parking available. We see that existing rapid transit tends to reduce on-street permit demand as well. But again, not always. Thinking of East Somerville, permit demand is quite high there, despite the fairly good transit access. We see that income is not really a strong predictor of on-street permit demand, even though coming into the study, we may have thought there was a relationship there. It appears that that's not a good predictor. Housing density tends to increase on-street parking permit demand. And then finally, car ownership also tends to increase on-street permit demand, but again, not everywhere. So if we look again at that permit density map, and I'll just scroll back to that so we can all see this. If we say, look at Winter Hill, for example, we know that a very high rate of people are driving to work in Winter Hill, and yet the permit demand is relatively low. And that's because, again, a lot of people have off-street parking and housing is less dense. So we need to try to understand this somewhat complicated relationship between housing characteristics and demographics and the permit program. And then finally, just as we wrap up this section of the presentation, we have collected overnight parking utilization data at a variety of areas across the city. So you can see those areas here. All of the colored areas are blocks that we have actually gone out and collected overnight parking data. And what we found is that in these areas, parking is on average 74% full. So certainly very well utilized, but there are in fact parking spaces available overall. when we take this number as a whole. But to be clear, that varies quite a bit depending on what neighborhood you're in, and more specifically what block you're parking on, right? So if we look at the red color here, if you are on a block that is colored red, that means that block is more than 95% full. So you're probably going to have a fairly difficult time trying to park on that block. If you are on a green or a blue block, parking may only be 50 or 70% full, and then that experience is going to be much easier for you parking. So it's important to understand that parking utilization is definitely a very local phenomenon, but we do want to make it clear that overall parking is 74% full. So in the areas that we observed, so there is potentially some additional parking supply to be found. So I'll just pause again there. We do have some live polling that we're going to get to next, but I think this is another good chance to respond to some of the chat questions that have come in.
Yes, and we are trying to get to them as quick as possible.
One question.
Yeah, go ahead.
While
Tom.
you're looking those over, is one that jumped out at me was whether the overnight data was collected during street sweeping season.
Yeah, great question. So we were very careful to collect data in areas only on days when streets were not impacted by street sweeping. So that was definitely something we took into account. So all the data that you see there was not collected when street sweeping, on a day when street sweeping was taking place.
And if I could just add to that, I think I understand where the questioner is going with this, and I want to point out that in past studies that we've done about parking, where we specifically went out and counted the same areas when there wasn't street sweeping and when there was, sort of surprisingly, the occupancy did not go up very much. It went up a couple percentage points, but was in some cases no different or even less than when street sweeping wasn't in effect on a neighborhood level. And I think a lot of that points to the fact that when there is street sweeping, people know that there's a schedule, they can plan in advance, and people do things like taking better advantage of driveways or parking further away from their home. So I just want to point out that the street sweeping doesn't necessarily mean there's half as much parking, at least on a neighborhood level.
Great, and I'm just going to pull up our live polling technology here. Just give me a second, and we can continue to respond to questions while we get that set up. Okay, so I think let's go ahead and move forward here with some live polling. So this is an opportunity for everyone on the call to go ahead and respond to a couple of questions regarding your priorities for Somerville's parking and curb system. So let me just explain how this functions. So what we're asking you to do here is go to www.menti.com, that's MENTI.com, and go ahead and enter the code you see here. So that's 73115822, and then that'll bring you to this page. And for this first question here, it looks like many of you already are in and answering the question, which is great. But go ahead and respond, and please rank in order your priorities from these choices for Somerville's curbside uses. And we'll just give a minute or two for everyone to do that. And we really appreciate all the input we're receiving today. And I'll just say again, There is an online survey that will be released next week as well. So this is certainly not your only opportunity to answer questions like these, but we really appreciate all of you being here today to provide this input. Okay, so I think at this point, it seems that many of us have had a chance to answer this first question. And again, please continue to respond if you haven't had a chance to make it through yet. We'll be saving these results moving forward. But I think we can see that transit and walking and access for people with disabilities, as well as bike facilities and bike parking have really emerged as high priorities among all the attendees today. So that's something we'll keep in mind. And then we see parking, on-street parking sort of coming in here as sort of a fifth priority, and then parklets, and then finally commercial and passenger loading space toward the bottom. So I think this is so helpful for us in terms of when we're thinking about goals for the study and how to allocate that curb space. So we'll continue to take in this input, and we'll share this out after the presentation as well, so all of you can see the results from this poll. Okay, so with that, I'm going to move on to our next question, and that should pop up on your devices now. So this is a similar question. We're asking you to rank these key curbside issues in the order that you sort of experience them the most, right? So whatever issues are most important to you or you experience the most, put those toward the top of the list, in rank order. And we'll just give a couple minutes again for everyone to answer that. Okay, so I think quite a few results have come in here. And again, please continue to respond to this poll, if you haven't had a chance to yet. But it looks like unsafe and unwelcoming walking and biking conditions have emerged really as the #1 issue that attendees of this meeting have experienced. So again, that's super helpful for us to understand, and that's definitely something we want to be careful in addressing over the course of the study. And then right behind that, we see limited access for non-driving modes. That could be things like public transportation or really any other type of non-driving mode. It seems that folks consider that to be a pretty key issue as well. And then conflicts with loading vehicles, that's emerging as the third ranked issue here. Again, that's something we really want to dive into and think about how we can be strategic in managing loading space, right? Because as we all know, if you're biking or walking or driving, loading vehicles that aren't managed well can certainly pose a hazard to other users of the street. It looks like enforcement and curb conflicts at bus stops and lack of parking are also something that plenty of us have experienced as well. Again, those are all things that we really want to address through this study. And then signage and some other issues coming in toward the bottom of the list. But again, something that we certainly want to look at as well. So we do have about 30 minutes left in our meeting. I'm going to switch us back to our presentation deck. But in the meantime, I think this is another opportunity to take some general questions before we get into our the remainder of our group discussion session. And Bryn, if you have any key questions, or Tom, that you'd like to elevate, you can address those.
Sure. One question is about the 2 survey questions that we posted, and it was about how we're examining what other means in these contexts. And people have been helpfully typing into the chat window what they meant by other, and we will continue to look into that and include them in our analysis of the responses. Second question is about how we ensure loading zones are clearly marked. Often people park there and delivery vehicles end up blocking crosswalks, bike lanes, etc.
Great. Yeah, I think to that second comment, again, certainly we expect loading activity to continue to increase throughout the city, right? Whether that's commercial loading or passenger loading. And right now, we sort of showed how loading zones typically function today. And I think there are strategies that we can bring in as we continue this study to better manage those zones, right? And whether it's conflicts with buses or other modes on the street, make sure that that loading activity isn't interfering with our other street users.
Yeah, nothing else to add. I would clarify that by transit parking, we do mean public transit. By contrast, passenger loading would capture taxis and Uber rides and even personal vehicles dropping off friends and family. Yeah, but yeah, I think these are helpful, and we'll take these into account to tweak the presentation for the other public workshops.
Great. Okay. So with that in mind, the sort of final part of our workshop today is, more of a sort of facilitated group discussion. So we have a couple of exercises that we've prepared where we're trying to gather some very specific and targeted input from all of you around some specific questions and themes for this study. So I think everyone who's present here today has been really engaged and active in the chat, which I think is awesome. And we're just going to continue to, keep managing the meeting through the chat. So I'll go ahead and introduce each of these exercises, and then please go ahead and provide your comments and questions and responses in the chat. And we'll pause after each of these and make sure that we try to address as many of those comments and questions as possible. So I'll go ahead with the first one here. So you can see this slide here. We're showing again our draft goals for the study. And what we'd love for all of you to do here is to tell us, are these the right goals? Is there a certain prioritization to these goals? And I think some of the input we just received from those live polls tells us a little bit about that. And also, are there things that we need to be thinking about doing to actually advance and achieve these goals? So I'll pause there, take a look at these, and please go ahead and drop your specific comments and questions in relationship to those questions in the chat, and we'll go ahead and respond to some of those.
So we have a couple comments about keeping small businesses in mind with looking into different policy changes or recommendations. I think a lot of the questions and interests of small businesses can be addressed in the public survey that will be launched next week. But please voice that perspective in the comments and in the chat. If you want us to take those in mind and hear about it from a local's perspective. So Alex is asking if there's historical data for how the road is being used compared to the current data we've collected to see what trend there is in terms of parking and vehicles.
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing that comes to mind is, again, when we shared some of that transportation mode share data with you today, that's based on the latest census data that we have. But of course, there's previous census data that can be analyzed as well. That's certainly something we could look at to sort of track how those mode shares have evolved over time.
Mark says, for me, maximizing the curb effectiveness is getting parking pricing right while also having discounts for low income parking. Chris says, I've read that New York City has citizen traffic enforcement. That seems worth considering here. There's a lot of comments about enforcement and improved enforcement being a goal, including adjustments in pricing of different permits or parking meters.
Great. Okay, so this is all extremely helpful feedback, and I think it's really interesting to see enforcement emerging as a theme in the comments. So we'll certainly be thinking carefully about enforcement strategies, as we move forward. I think parking pricing came up. That's certainly another thing, and the permit programs as well. So all of those are things we'll be diving into. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to our next sort of targeted engagement exercise here. So what we're asking you to do here is take a look at this map and think about, where do you usually park? Whether you're a resident or a worker or a business owner, what's your usual parking place? But we also want to know, what's your favorite place to park? Maybe it's not the place you park every day, but it's the one you wish you could. And then finally, what's your secret place to park, right? The place where, maybe when all else fails, that's where you go to always get a space. So we'll just give a few more minutes to go through this, and go ahead and type, as detailed or as not detailed as you want some of your responses to those three. And I'll just add more broadly, if that sounds a little bit complicated, we're happy to take any comments more generally that are really just related to, where is it easy to park? Where is it difficult to park? Obviously, we know that different neighborhoods of the city function differently. So, let us know your thoughts.
There's a comment from Ruben saying, I live in Davis and parking is generally fine except for street sweeping days. Then I find myself circling the streets in the evening to find an open spot. It's particularly difficult recently with a lot of spaces taken up for construction. There's comments that Sundays are bad. Parking in loading zones on Highland is also frequent. Someone comments that they don't drive and don't park as a result. It's difficulty parking near the high school and city hall.
Some repeated concerns about sufficiency of ADA designated parking at the curb. Obviously needs to be in closer proximity than most drivers.
Definitely a few comments about Highland. Also parking on Webster Avenue.
Great. And I think, again, in the interest of time, we're going to move on to the next exercise here. I did see a comment asking about participant info and how many people have attended the call. I believe that's something that we can share following the end of this meeting. So look forward to that.
And just to quickly add, at the peak of attendance, it was around 65 people.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to move us on here to our next question. This question is specifically about the parking permit program. So obviously there's quite a few questions here, and we may not have time to really, dive deeply into every single one of these. But I think more broadly, we want to understand what is or is not working with the current parking permit program. Any comments or thoughts related to that are valuable. And I think specifically, we're interested if people are using permits to park only or primarily at home and work, or if they're being used to park at other locations around the city as well. We're also interested in thoughts around if permits should be limited based on the configuration of your housing, or perhaps if you have access to off-street parking, do we want zone-based permits? We have obviously quite a few potential ideas here. So we'd love to hear your comments on that, and then expect to hear more from us on the online survey and in the future regarding ideas for the permit program.
Ruben expressing appreciation for the citywide use of his permit to go to friends' houses and visit stores. Some suggestion to separate daytime from nighttime permits. One suggestion to, and this is echoes comments that have been coming in throughout the presentation about right pricing the permits, that it's quite low, obviously, making accommodation for lower income households, but for a market rate, the permit being quite low.
So I do see a comment here I wanted to address regarding, oh, I thought my permit was zoned, and that is true, right? So as you can see here, there are permit enforcement zones that the city uses to administrate the permit system throughout the city. That's displayed on this map. However, under current regulations, you are allowed to use your parking permit to park anywhere in the city. So while these zones exist and they're helpful for administration, your parking permit, assuming you have a regular, annual permit, is valid anywhere in the city right now. But we are taking comments on whether that should continue to function that way.
And just in case that person was referring to a business parking permit, those are the only type of permit that is assigned to a specific street.
Yes, and I'll just chime in with the guest permits as well. Guest permits are more strictly restricted, or more restricted to where you live and your address.
Right. Lots of comments on potential ideas to reform some of the permits and some of the rules around specific permit types.
Including for deliveries, which is something that some cities have done as a way of pricing that aspect of curb access.
Great. Okay. Well, I think I don't want to move on from this exercise too quickly, because I think we're getting some really excellent conversation. And again, the permit program is a really central piece to how parking is managed in Somerville. As you all saw, the vast majority of parking spaces are permit parking spaces, right? So the permit program is perhaps the single biggest piece of the puzzle here as we move forward.
Also a suggestion from Seth to replace visitor permits with meters that visitors could use instead of having a permit, which is definitely something other cities have been doing for a while and sort of gaining some attention nationwide, I think.
Great. Okay. So thank you all again for all of the fantastic comments and questions on the permit program. We're going to go ahead and move forward. We do have a few more exercises we want to get through. So the next exercise here is asking all of you to please identify for us areas where you feel there are conflicts between different people trying to use the curb lane. That could be conflicts between vehicles and bicycles. That could be conflicts occurring at bus stops, or it could be double parking due to loading or other issues at the curb. Really, any of those type of conflict events would be great to know about. So please go ahead and tell us what streets or what neighborhoods or what specific areas you're experiencing them.
Seeing Elm Street and Davis Square, all of Broadway, the south side of Beacon Street, where delivery trucks can double park in the bike lane. Another instance of Broadway, Washington Street. As a cyclist, often feel extremely unsafe around buses, particularly as they pull in and out of bus stops. Conflicts between cyclists and loading and unloading activity, whether that's residential deliveries from Amazon or U-Hauls or other delivery vehicles. Chris mentions major commercial districts like Davis and Union, where there's a lot of pickup and drop off activity from Ubers and taxis, as well as delivery vehicles from the major companies like UPS and FedEx pulling over in unsafe spaces. Question
Great.
about
So,
what sort of curb uses and designs help contribute to slower streets or safer conditions?
great. And I've just swapped the map here over to a map of the bus boardings and alightings throughout the city. Again, same questions here, just keep them coming. But we wanted to share where bus stops are located in case that helps anyone kind of orient themselves.
Comments on Beacon Street again, as well as Somerville Ave around the Market Basket. There's a lot of demand at the grocery store.
So I think I've seen a few comments now related to conflicts between bicyclists and loading vehicles, really on both sides of that question. I think from the bicyclist perspective, vehicles loading in bike lanes are certainly a hazard. And then in terms of our loading needs, we know that in some areas, there just may not be enough loading zones to accommodate the demand. So I think both sides of that question are really important and something we want to address. Okay, so we're starting to get to the end of our workshop time in about 15 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and move on. We just have a couple exercises left before we wrap up. So with this exercise here, we would love to hear from all of you about how you feel curb space should be prioritized. So again, this goes back to some of the previous questions we asked and some of our live polling. But again, there's really sort of a trade-off between offering additional on-street parking and using that curb space for some other uses, whether that be transit lanes or wider sidewalks or greenery or outdoor dining and all of the other different types of uses of the curb. So what we'd ask you to do now is just go ahead and type your comments regarding how you would like to see curb space prioritized across this variety of uses.
Got a couple comments about bike lanes being a priority, prioritizing cyclists and pedestrian traffic, adding more greenery to the city. Additional accessible parking.
I've seen several comments now that seem to be in favor of both outdoor dining and wider sidewalks. I think we've all experienced how the city has changed in some neighborhoods over the last couple of years with all of the additional outdoor dining space. And that's definitely something we want to think about integrating and keeping over a longer term as we think about the curb system.
Also a comment to reconcile the lack of access to the outdoor dining space, which is a lot of the outdoor dining space has really expanded during COVID. And so a lot of the planning is catching up to how to do that right. So that's definitely worth noting.
Great. Okay. And again, not to cut this exercise short, but we are approaching our time and we do have one more exercise we wanted to go through here. So this is similar to the one that we were just dealing with. So let me sort of explain how this functions. So you can see this sort of 8 sets of images here with some captions around them. These are pictures of various types of curb uses around the city and some different activities that are taking place. What we would love for all of you to do now is tell us, when you're looking at these images, what features do you see that you like? What features do you see that you don't like? And what features are missing? So please go ahead and tell us that. For further consideration, we would also love to know, do you support these features or not? But also, are there specific areas or locations where you do support it, right? So obviously, every street in Somerville doesn't look the same, nor should they. So go ahead and take a few minutes to respond to these images.
And Jason, can you please describe what each of the images are for the folks who've logged in as a phone call or
Absolutely.
can't see them very clearly?
Absolutely happy to do that. So our first image here is showing a on-street bike rack that's full of bikes, and some cones have been placed to repurpose some on-street parking for a pedestrian area. I believe that's in Union Square. And then we're also showing with that image a painted sort of curb bulb out to make pedestrian crossing easier at an intersection in Somerville. The second image, we're showing buses and bikes using a shared bus and bike lane, which is also adjacent to some on-street parking and bus stop space. We're then showing bikes using a buffered bike lane, which is providing separation both from the travel lane as well as the parked cars that are adjacent to it, as well as some vehicles that are loading next to the bike lane. We then have an image showing some on-street dining taking place in an area that was once, that was repurposed from on-street parking. We then have an image of a street of on-street residential parking that is completely full, and vehicles are parked up to the very edge of the stop bar at the intersection. We then have an image of a passenger vehicle loading at the curbside, and while it's loading, it's somewhat obstructing a crosswalk. We then have an image of a parking meter that's been bagged with a sign that says 15-minute parking to allow for some short-term parking and loading space in an area that was previously metered parking. And then our last image is showing sharrows for bikes on a street. So no dedicated bike infrastructure, just sharrows, and then we have parking on both sides of the street.
Thanks for that, Jason. There is one comment about labeling these pictures with letters for tomorrow evening's presentation, which we can definitely do to make it easier to respond via the chat.
So I think a lot of great comments are coming in here. I see one person commenting, this is from Ted, that he likes the bus and bike lanes, even as a not very experienced cyclist, and that they generally felt safe. So I think that's important feedback for us. There's another comment here about painted bulb outs, that those feel like they're generally ineffective. This is from Seth. And that really they should be just used as a precursor to actual physical bulb outs.
Great. Feel free to continue to type in some comments into the chat window, but we definitely want to make sure we get to discussing the next steps of the study before we run out of time.
I did want to read one other contrasting comment to some of the earlier comments from Rebecca, who says that the bike lanes that are depicted here are not safe enough for me to feel comfortable using them with my family. So maybe they're useful for some commuters, but not necessarily for a family. I think that's good feedback as well. And of course, there are different types of cyclists, right? And different people have different comfort levels. So certainly something to keep in mind. With that, I think we've only got about 4 minutes left in our allotted time. So again, thank you so much to everyone who joined the call. We are so happy to hear from all of you today and gather all this feedback. You can expect to have this presentation posted online so that you can review it in more detail in the future. And then please do go ahead and respond to the online survey as well. And we'd love to have you join us at our 2 future public meetings and throughout this process. And just a reminder on next steps for the study. I wanted to show our study schedule again here. So again, the online survey should open sometime next week. And then that will run likely through early January to give folks plenty of time to respond. And then we will likely reconvene with another community meeting at some point in April of 2022. At that point, we should have draft recommendations, which will have emerged from the study, and we'll be taking feedback on those, and then holding a third and final community meeting in July to present the final study as well. Moving on, some of the next steps for us on the project team will be to, 1, evaluate all the fantastic input that we've received today, and then also begin to do some scenario planning, looking at the potential impact of, for example, keeping our parking policies the way that they are today, making some targeted changes in a variety of scenarios, and understanding how that could impact overall parking demand and the allocation of right-of-way to a variety of different uses. So that's going to be a big next step for us. And then, of course, we'll be starting to develop our policy recommendations once we've gathered input, again, from all of you, and also through that online survey. And those recommendations could include a variety of things. They could include strategies to reduce demand, strategies to distribute that parking demand better across the city, strategies related to safety and equitable access, technology solutions, even potentially parking supply expansions, administration, and more. So we'll be looking at really everything we possibly can to improve how we're managing parking and the curbside. And then finally, we'll be developing a curb space prioritization framework as well as part of our final recommendations. This means that, again, we want to consider all uses of the curb, right? Parking is a big part of that. But as we've heard today from many of the folks on this meeting, there are so many other things happening at the curb that we need to be considerate of as well. And that's exactly what this curb space prioritization framework will help us to do. So again, please continue to stay engaged. Keep an eye out for follow-up information from this team and from the city. Respond to our survey. And again, thank you so much for attending this meeting. And for those of you who may have family or friends or neighbors who weren't able to attend today's meeting, we are holding a similar, or I should say identical session tomorrow night for those who are unable to attend today. So happy to take further comments at that time. And with that, I think it is 2 p.m., so we will go ahead and wrap up. But again, thank you so much for attending, and we look forward to hearing more from all of you in the future.
Thanks, everyone.